Hey guys, it's Luke Johnson.
And Jordan Klein. We're back.
Welcome back to the second installment of our comprehensive overview of Soren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, a dialectical lyric. We covered a ton of ground in the initial installment, so some of this might be a little repetitious. Oh, Kierkegaard joke there. So we will be covering repetition tomorrow. We took a little bit of a lunch break, got a little perception on this. I think a lot of the concepts that we'll go in here before we start addressing the three problemas will be sort of stuff that might be already familiar to you all as the result of listening to the first installment. Something that we need to know in Fear and Trembling is that Kierkegaard, he's talking about Abraham and Isaac, and then sort of inexplicably introduces this story about the lad and the princess. What do you remember about the story of the lad and the princess, Jordan? Do you recall anything about it from your read-through of it?
Yeah, lad falls for princess. Princess is completely unobtainable.
Why should they have different stations in life, and their love can never be realized or something, right? Mm-hmm. And the point of this is kind of to show how... Well, I think the point of this is to operate on a couple different levels, right? Like on one level, again, this is the code to Regina, right? To the to Kierkegaard's engagement that he's broken off, the love that can't be realized, the renunciation, and the perhaps movement of having her back again. Right. But then also, this is another situation, another permutation of trying to understand what the Knight of Infinite Resignation looks like and how he differs from the Knight of Faith. And in this story, prior to the act of renunciation, like many people who fall in love for the first time, and I can relate to this, is that the person sort of becomes the defining center of your world. Right. Mm-hmm. So much so that if you were to lose that person, like you would just fall.
Your entire reality just like collapses in on you.
Right. And as a young person, I did this. I totally would deify romantic partners, so they would become the all-encompassing center of my world, and it is so utterly crushing. It feels like when the relationship ends, it feels like you've lost your Siamese twin. It feels like a massive part of you is missing. Yeah. Did this speak to you as well? I mean, the thing is, I actually, I've lived this. I've lived this lad and princess story, and maybe we've all lived this lad and princess story.
I think we all have to some degree. It's when you become so invested in a relationship and it just it ends, and if it just becomes like your center of attention and focus, it just collapses in on you. You kind of feel like you collapse with it a little bit.
Totally. So this love can't be realized, and so what is the Knight of Infinite Resignation to do in this situation? In order to have leverage over the situation where they're just not completely crestfallen and dysfunctional in life, the Knight of Infinite Resignation has to concentrate his being into some sort of higher level. Essentially, he has to transfer the love that he has for the princess to the love of God, and this gives him some sort of leverage over the world and gives what I guess Kierkegaard would call eternal consciousness. So the realm of the finite doesn't have as much control over the Knight of Infinite Resignation. Mm-hmm.
So I guess my question is, how do you enter that state of eternal consciousness? Do you have to go through that movement of sort of like heartbreak, or realize that your princess is like never attainable, and then is that when you go through that movement to eternal consciousness? I was just wondering, how do you enter that state?
I think it, depending on what your princess is, right? Like everybody's got this analogy. It's like in some instances it's an actual princess, like it's a woman, right? Like, or it's a Grammy, or it's money, or it's something else. Right. I think the point is that you get to this point when you realize that you're chasing these ephemeral things, these things that ultimately come and go. Like the princess, will come and go. She is a finite thing. Money, you can't take it with you. Right. Grammys, I mean, that's a silly award bestowed upon humans that will be never remembered 3,000 years from now. No one will give a F like how Uptown Funk did in 2013 or whenever that song came out. So I think the point is with Kierkegaard is that you get to that point of Knight of Infinite Resignation when you realize the hollowness of all these temporal and ephemeral pursuits, right? And that you realize that by concentrating your being around that ultimately it leads to existential bankruptcy or existential shipwreck. And that ultimately, if your life is going to have any stable force of which you can build it around, it has to be around something that's eternal.
Right, so that makes sense. So is it I guess what I'm sort of asking is, how does that movement or that transition take place? Because you can have that sort of revelation and realize that it's not going to last. So, okay, let's change gears. Is it just centering your attention? Is it willing yourself to only really focus on eternal things? I'm just wondering, how do you arrive?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you're asking what does it mean to concentrate your being around eternal things? And
yes,
I mean, does that mean that you the Night of Infinite Resignation? I think has a couple options open to him. I mean, and I think Socrates would be a perfectly fine example of. I kind of think of Socrates as a Night of Infinite Resignation in ways, because he didn't care for the temporal world. He didn't really care what happened to him. He was willing to give up his life for the sake of objective truth or the pursuit of philosophy. So within the realm of eminence, and we've talked about this in other podcasts, the eminence is sort of things that we can sort of reach on our own without sort of transcendental help from God, specifically the incarnation. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, as far as how you get that eternally conscious perspective, I think philosophy is a route. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, a lot of people don't realize this.
But what about, the everyday person? I mean, there's sometimes where I just get frustrated with philosophy. I'm like, whatever, this isn't even useful.
Well, it depends on what you considered philosophy to be. I mean, philosophy is supposed to be this thing that's apprehending the eternal. Mm-hmm. So maybe you throw yourself into mathematics. Maybe you throw yourself into science. Maybe you throw yourself into your moral effort. Mm-hmm. In a way, these all are aspects of the eternal. Mm-hmm. And then I guess the only other way I would say about it is that you can sort of nebulously sort of pray and meditate too. A lot of people don't realize this, but Socrates did occasionally pray. Right before he dies, there's some prayer right before he dies. So, I mean, I think these are ways to resign. It's an attitude. There are certain life activities that you can engage in. But I think in general, it's to sort of drain all the substance and joy from this world, to really be a night of infinite resignation. Otherwise, you are sort of receding back to earlier existence stages, and they will just merely distract you for a time. Mm-hmm. And so you can live like an aesthete again,
right?
But ultimately it's going to end up in just fleeting joy. It's not going to be a sustainable sort of joy. So you take some sort of pleasure by being removed and knowing that existence can't affect you.
Okay.
What do you think about that? You buying that? Doesn't seem like you're buying.
I mean,
that.
I'm having trouble reconciling. I don't know, can you, I don't know, for instance, be a sort of a knight of faith, but really like poetry?
Of course.
So it doesn't be, it's not a mutually exclusive thing. It's not saying, if you are a knight of faith, then you cannot enjoy, these things that are, aesthetically pleasing.
I like to think of myself, and though I mean, it's just I'm probably committing so many Kierkegaardian sins by saying this. I like to think of myself at my best moments as a knight of faith. I think the Night of Infinite Resignation is one that is more natural for me. Mm-hmm. I think just like there are other existence stages that are more natural for other people, I think being ethical is more natural for some people. Being aesthetical is more natural for some people. But at my best moment, when my best angels are in control, I would like to think of myself as sort of a knight of faith. But guess what I love? I love people and music and poetry, and I don't have to forsake any of these things. It's just a matter of how I approach them after I've made the revolutions of spirit. I don't have to become a monk to be a Christian. I don't have to be a monk.
That's to say that you can also be in flux. This is not a fixed state.
Yes, you are not to think of the existential stage theory of Soren Kierkegaard as something that is static, frozen in time, and then once you cross one boundary, you're forever in it and you can't go back to it. This is why Kierkegaard talks about Kierkegaard never proclaims himself to be a Christian. And that's part of the reason why he uses all these misdirecting pseudonyms, is because he realized he was in flux. And some works and some phases in his life were more appropriately from the Night of Infinite Resignation's perspective. Other works were from the Night of Faith's perspective. Other works are from the aesthetic perspective. It's like nesting dolls. They stay with us, and we can access them should we choose. The point is of being a Knight of Faith is something that it's constantly something you have to reappropriate. And that's an idea that we'll take up a good bit when CJ and I cover the concept of repetition. Cool. So, that means that that means that the self is going to be destabilized in a sense.
Right. I mean, if you're constantly working on yourself, then
there's always work to do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, I never would, like, consider myself a perfect person, because that means that you're entirely complete and like, oh, there's nothing else I can improve, nothing else I can work on. So, yeah, I mean, it seems, I don't know, maybe, I don't want to say intuitive, but it makes sense to me.
Cool. Yeah, like, and there's like, this is, what I'm saying is not indisputable, because there is sort of a boundary when one becomes a Christian for Kierkegaard, where there is like you have to square what I just said with what I said in the last podcast about how there is a breaking of a self and where an old self is thrown down and a new theological self emerges, right? So how can you have it both ways? How can you have a self that's dynamic and can regress, but one that can also be saved? And what does it mean to be saved and to be living in faith and free from the sin of prior existence stages? But that's probably for someone else's master's thesis or dissertation to take up.
It's a big fish to fry.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. Feel free to ask some other questions. I mean, the thing is with this lad and the princess thing, I think it's to indicate that this is as far as man can go on his own, right? Is to renounce the princess and sort of take pleasure in this eternal vantage point. But to go further, to become the Knight of Faith, that's where trust in the absurd, trust in God that all things are possible, and that is going to be where a divine human interaction occurs. So you cannot become a Knight of Faith, and I can't stress this enough, on your own. Okay. Though you can, as a Knight of Infinite Resignation, do that on your own.
Okay, so basically, we could think of the Knight of Resignation as almost a way stop.
Yes. The Knight of Infinite Resignation is one move away from the Knight of Faith. The Knight of Faith does something that... The Knight of Faith was a Knight of Infinite Resignation, and then they trusted God and kept loving the world, but also giving up the world, and received the world back anew.
Right.
So that's going to be the major... The reason why the Knight of Infinite Resignation does not become the Knight of Faith is because they cannot exercise that trust in God. They can't
fully...
They cannot break the autonomy entirely and give it over to God.
Okay. So, with the Knight of Faith, I think Mooney says, he's at home in the eternal, but happy also in the midst of the world. So, is that kind of... that sentiment similar to, I don't know, I tend to think of, I don't know, kind of like Robin Hood, with like a traveling, monk or like a preacher or something like that.
Explain it. It's been a while since I've watched Robin Hood.
I'm thinking the one from like the 70s, like the animated one.
With the fox or whatever?
Yeah.
So what do you mean?
I mean, I don't know, just kind of the, I don't know why that particular image came to mind, but... kind of, when I'm thinking, or like Canterbury Tales, where you have these sort of like roving packs of people just out in the world, and they're placing trust in God to take care of them.
Yeah.
God will see to it that I'm fed today, while I'm, making my pilgrimage.
I've got to look into that particular question a little bit more. There's an essay that Kierkegaard did, and it's from what I understand, it's one of the more poetical ones that we should check out. It's called of the birds and lilies of the field, right? And it goes off that whole proverb about the anxiety that humans experience as the result of trying to totally coordinate every aspect of their lives, whereas the bird and the lilies don't think anything of the future, and yet everything is provided of them for them. So I think that particular question would address that particular essay, and you probably hinted at something I need to take up. What I want to do here real quick, I think we covered a lot of these pretty essential concepts. I think the big thing is to go through as quickly as we can in this comprehensive overview, because really, I mean, I could take I could take 2 or 3 podcasts with each one of these, but we need to go through the problemas that are at the back half of Fear and Trembling. And what we need to understand, there are these problemas that ask if there's a teleological suspension of the ethical. We have to talk about what that means.
And we need to unpack that, because what the heck?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
We have to talk about, is there an absolute duty to God, and whether or not Abraham was justified in his silence towards Sarah, Isaac, and I believe Eliezer. I'm not sure who Eliezer was. I think he might have been a servant or something like that. All right, so let's talk about these. So the point of these problemas for Kierkegaard is to show the limitations of the Hegelian perspective. The Hegelian perspective tries to rationalize all of existence and say, oh, look, it's all sane and comprehensible or whatever. And Kierkegaard uses the Abraham story to be like, Hegelianism.
Hold on.
Put on the brakes. You've got nothing figured out.
So like there are limits on reason.
Right.
Reason cannot explain everything away.
Yeah, if we're going to be Hegelian Christians, there are aspects of Christianity, i.e. the incarnation, which is not going to be talked about a lot here,
right,
but other figures within the Bible that do not fit into the Christian Hegelian narrative, right?
Like
and
that mold.
Like, so if there isn't a teleological suspension of the ethical, Abraham is lost and is a madman. If there isn't an absolute duty to God that trumps that ethical, then Abraham is lost. If Abraham isn't justified in remaining silent, then Abraham is lost, right? Like, how can the father of our faith be lost and Hegelianism be right? And Kierkegaard's going to be like,
it's either Hegel or
whose side
Abraham,
are you on?
basically.
Are you on Abraham's side or Hegel's side? Because Abraham doesn't integrate into Hegel,
right?
And Abraham, I think we have to. There are going to be other things that don't integrate into Hegel. Job doesn't integrate into Hegel, and specifically Christ does not integrate into Hegel. So the first problema is this teleological suspension of the ethical. All right, so what do we mean by the teleological suspension of the ethical? I mean, I could go on forever about this.
Please, out of kindness to me and our lovely listeners, just try to keep it pared down.
Yeah, so the ethical always holds sway, right? The point of the ethical is so that we become good ethically existing people. And if we dispute that, we are rescinding ourselves to immediacy, to animalistic behavior, to being in the school of fish. We lower ourselves down to something more bestial, something more in touch with our instincts or whatever. And
so that's what happens when we suspend ethical.
Well, if we suspend it out of I guess what Augustine would say, inordinate desire. Okay. Right?
Now you're talking my language.
Right.
Okay.
It's pure selfishness, right? Like the reason
just
why we would
desires.
Right, we would be choosing ourselves over the universally understood ethical.
Okay.
But for Abraham to not be someone driven by inordinate desire, there has to be a teleological suspension of the ethical, meaning there has to be a higher purpose for the ethical to be suspended than the fashioning of an ethical agent.
Okay.
Remember, Abraham was already a blameless and upright man, just like Job.
Right.
These were like dedicated servants of God. I mean, you could make the case that Abraham messed up by maybe he doubted the covenant that he made with God by having Ishmael with Hagar. But in general, these are people that are the best in God's eyes. They already embody the universal ethical, whatever that thing may be. So is Abraham descending back into immediacy when he asserts himself against that universal ethical? And the answer is, well, I mean, Kierkegaard's not going to give us an answer, because if you could calculate it, you would have a maxim for how you choose or whatever. That possibly the scenario is that Abraham has a higher calling that God is going to draw Abraham closer by individuating him from the ethical so that he becomes a more integrated being by the encounter with God and receive the world back with more integrity, freedom, autonomy than he had when he was just living in ethical categories.
Okay.
He is made a better person. He is further individuated. His life is given more significance. He encounters God directly, and therefore there is a higher purpose for him expressing his individuality over the universal ethical. Okay. If that is not the case, if there is not this higher teleology, this religious teleology that justifies Abraham clinging to the commands of God over the commands of the universal ethical, then Abraham is a murderer, plain and simple.
Right. Yeah.
That is, but we don't know that situation. We haven't been asked by God to sacrifice the son that we waited 70 years for.
I know, I haven't been tapped on the shoulder to do that. I don't think you have.
Yeah, so Kierkegaard can't really say what the scenario is, but he's trying to illustrate the different views so that we can sort of get a sense of where we go. And really, the religious perspective becomes more palatable and when we start thinking about how we can enact it through our relationship with Christ, which is not so much covered here in Fear and Trembling. All right.
Oh boy.
Problema 2. Is there an absolute duty toward God? All right. So let's talk about that a little bit. I've skipped around my notes a little bit. Whatever. I'm going to just jump right into it. I'm going to hope that I covered enough of it. That's fine. So Problema 2. Is there an absolute duty to God? Kierkegaard is very concerned with all this talk of rational ethical stuff promulgated by Kant and Hegel, that people believe they have a relationship with God when they really don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
People believe that they are interacting with God as the result of their moral performance. They just think, okay, I'm going to wake up, I'm going to do excellence, and therefore me and God are cool.
Yeah, or just doing the ethical thing like, I held the door for someone, picked up my piece of litter. You know, it's like, that automatically gets you off the hook for being, a good, not a good person, but potentially a religious person. Or do people mistakenly think, oh, well, I'm a nice person, I'm an ethical person, therefore I have a good relationship with God?
Yeah. And what Kierkegaard believes is Abraham shows that that's a delusion, right? So when we have everybody acting in accordance with moral standards, what's happening is that man has a relationship to an ethical formula and not so much God as the foundational ontological lawgiver of that formula.
Okay.
So if ethics for you is the Kantian categorical imperative, where does God really fit in? Like, where is the real communion with God? Mm. Are you really consulting God, or is he kind of like an afterthought thesis that's used to bolster the ethical position in some way?
Yeah, you should act in an ethical manner because God said so.
Right. But that's sort of self-defeating if you sort of take that from the Kantian perspective, because the whole point of the Kantian categorical imperative is that it's to be pure and not to be constrained by any sort of outside force like God. But for whatever reason, political or something, Kant believes that he can slip God back into the mix. What Kierkegaard does to show that there has to be an absolute duty to God here is that Abraham is able to heed a higher call. Like, Abraham is able to interact and commune with God directly because Abraham bypasses the ethical stage and shakes hands with God on Mount Moriah. I don't know exactly when it all happened, but Abraham shows to humanity that something more is possible and ought to be pursued. I hate using that word ought because in a way you can talk about this being existentially justified. Ought to be pursued like that our whole being shouldn't just be concentrated to ethical performance, because if we concentrate...
There's a realm beyond the ethical that is worth looking into.
Exactly. And if we concentrate our entire being into ethical performance, not only will we be cut off from God, but being cut off from God, like relating to a complex ethical formula, means that we don't get the misrelations of the self ironed out. The only way, on Kierkegaard's view, that we ever attain anything like felicity or some sort of meaning or significance or something like that is when we finally rest in God. And when we're chasing ephemera around in the aesthetic stage, we encounter despair. And when we go around in ethical and we try to be a good person, we encounter despair because we are finite beings and we're going to F up. We have limited resources. We can't change the world.
Yeah. I mean, not to mention, if you're acting in an ethical framework, it's usually because it's self-serving to a degree. Like, I don't go around killing people because it's wrong, and part of me wants to stay out of prison.
Yeah.
So I think there's also that self-serving element to being ethical because it benefits you in a way.
There's a calculation in it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the thing is, when you go and shake hands with God or whatever, when you have this communion with God in the religious sphere or whatever, you were asking me before, like, why wouldn't you just become a monk? Why wouldn't you just leave this world behind or whatever? You don't think about it. I mean, so there are going to be episodes where we do think about it. But when you have that salvific experience where it saves you from the sin that previous existing stages and despair that is endemic to previous existence stages, out of a sense of, I don't want to say it becomes unconscious and automatic, but it becomes, you are reborn so that it makes it so that you can love people genuinely. Now, I think a great way to test if you actually have been reborn and you need to constantly reappropriate the faith relationship is how far you can test that hypothesis of genuine love of neighbor. Like, I think it's easy for me to say, I love the grocery clerk. I love the waitress. I love my mother and father. But what about when things get, like, super complicated? Like, I used the example last podcast about the Pope forgiving the person that tried to assassinate him. Or, I don't know if you remember a couple years ago when there was the Ebola outbreak. Mm-hmm. And I thought these doctors and these nurses that were going to Africa to cure people or take care of people with Ebola were totally insane. Like, I could not get my mind around that. I was like Kierkegaard. I was like Johann de Silencio here. I can't understand this. Why? Because they're essentially they're gonna expose themselves to Ebola,
right,
and die themselves.
Yeah,
I couldn't get my mind around that.
Yeah, it's just incredibly selfless.
But those individuals, those doctors and nurses that put themselves in harm's way to love the other, like, they got nothing out of that. Like, they're just trusting in God, right? Like, they were the knights of faith. And I was Johann de Silencio being like, what is going on here? Just don't go anywhere near that. Right. Like, it's a horrible thing. But, like, it's too risky. You know, just like it's a tragedy. It's too risky, and they went into it. Or like firefighters. I wouldn't be a firefighter. I would go running out of a building when it's on fire, and there are other people that run into them.
Yeah, or like, I mean, Orlando, there are people who, you know, ran out and then ran back in and helped carry people. Yeah, and helped them, like, load them into, like, ambulances and, you know, police cars. And
I think that's a great way to. Like, what would you do? I think that might be a way to test if you really do trust God. If you really do trust God, whatever the outcome is, you will be okay with it.
Right.
I think that's kind of all right. So, So I guess what I'm saying is to answer this problema, like, either Abraham had an absolute duty to God, and he was merely doing what was natural. When you have that encounter with God, of course you're going to obey that.
I do have one question.
Sure. Or he's lost, yeah.
So in fulfilling your absolute duty, do you often just fulfill the ethical by default?
The ethical, yeah, I would say so. I mean, I'm sure we could come up with complex ethical scenarios where religious performance is at odds with ethical performance. Mm-hmm. But typically the way I think about it is that whatever is done in religious performance supersedes whatever is done in ethical performance. Like, but there are, I mean, the thing is, it's not really scrutable. Like, I mean,
right.
Like, I tend to think of
it's a case by case basis.
Yeah, I tend to think of ethical action as obligatory, and I tend to think of religious action as what is known in philosophy as supererogatory or above and beyond, like above like the bare minimum. So like when you have this encounter with God in the faith relationship, especially as it's defined in Christianity, Christianity asks you to do things that no ethical theory would ask you to do. You know, like Kant's theory doesn't ask you to go cure Ebola. You know, like, I mean, maybe some Kantians would dispute me on that. Kant's ethical theory doesn't ask us to do stuff like that. Utilitarianism may not ask us to do things like that. Hegelian societal roles may not ask us to do things like that.
Gotcha.
But Christianity is going to be like pressing it to the max. And that's the thing that Kierkegaard's trying to... Like, we think we understand Christianity, but cognitively, Kierkegaard's trying to say cognitively, it's so much harder than you think. Like, it's not this cute little theology of, like, that you were taught in Bible school. It's something you can't comprehend because it's replete with paradoxes. So give up on that. And then the performance of it, you think you're a good Christian? Oh, don't you ever get complacent with that. When was the last time you helped somebody with Ebola? You're not. You're nowhere near where you think you are.
So you're never really quite settled, I guess, in your
there's always God's work is always there to be done. Like, if you think you have arrived as a Christian, you are not a Christian. You know what I'm saying?
So Kierkegaard
like, if you
would
think
have,
you're
like,
there, you're not.
Kierkegaard would have like a field day with the conquistador then.
Oh, what do you mean? Explain that.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you think that...
Oh, like claiming things for, like, countries and stuff? Like spreading Christendom? Well, oh, yeah, he'd hate that.
Yeah, I mean, so... So I guess, would he be a fan of, I don't know, like, missionary, like, work? Or would... Or is that doing God's work versus... I
think it depends on
versus being a conquistador when you just...
I think it depends on the nature
oppress people and you commit genocide and then just say, oh, I did it in the name of... I did it for God, so it's cool. I think
it depends on what the goal of the mission work is. I think as we've seen here, it's like, does Kierkegaard approve of poetry? Well, it depends what role the poetry is serving and why you're doing the poetry, right? If you're doing the poetry just to seduce women, then no.
Yeah, then
if you're doing
probably not. But
if you're doing the poetry to work through existential entanglements or praise God, then yes. Is Kierkegaard anti-music? Well, it depends. Is Kierkegaard anti-philosophy?
Depends.
Well, it depends. Certain types of philosophy. He's an anti-Hegelian philosophy, but he's using philosophy to critique philosophy. So he's using philosophy on some level. It's like everything can be redeemed on the Christian existentialist perspective. And this is something I have to tell people when you're studying Kierkegaard is like, you don't have to stop loving what you love. You just love it a little differently.
That makes sense.
Like, I came to Jesus, like, authentically, somewhere in my PhD. I don't know if I can pinpoint it exactly. It's probably been like a progressive sort of appropriation. Like, it's not like philosophy stopped mattering to me. In fact, it may matter a little bit more now. If I didn't have that religious point of view. But that's a digression and for another day. So let's address this third problema, okay?
Sure.
So the third problema... it talks about whether or not Abraham was justified in being silent to Sarah, Eliezer, and Isaac. And aesthetically, you can invent all sorts of reasons to lie for your own advantage if we're talking about your own inordinate desire. Right. Ethically, you got to tell the truth. Ethically, Kant would say tell the truth. But from... because of the complex nature of the ordeal that Abraham had to endure, he can't possibly express it because no one can walk in his shoes. And Kierkegaard is trying to help us understand what it was like to take that ascent to Mount Moriah as best as he can. But ultimately, he can't say definitively one way or the other if Abraham was right to speak or not. All he can really say is that if all this stuff really happened, if God was really speaking to Abraham and gave him this ordeal, there's no way he could have communicated it to any of them. And had he divulged it, Had he divulged it, he would have entered into spiritual trial because he would have told the truth and descended back into the ethical stage, and then they would have tried to stop him from his divinely appointed task. So depending on the perspective, aesthetically, conceal it. Ethically, you got to disclose it.
Yep.
Religiously, conceal it again. So he wasn't wrong but it depends on what you're willing to believe. It depends on which existential perspective you're willing to try on. So that's all I got. Man, we got through that a little faster. I think I jumped over a lot of things. But, that's a good comprehensive overview. I'm not going to beat myself up too much. What do you think? I think we covered a lot of it. Do you have any parting sort of questions?
Yeah, I mean, the silence doesn't make sense. Like, if God tapped me on the shoulder and we had a conversation, how on earth would you be able to articulate that conversation without seeming like you've lost touch with your senses?
Yeah, I mean, you would seem like a total madman.
Yeah, so, I mean, does... Yeah, I mean, just how... That kind of like a revelation, like, how do you articulate that?
You can't.
Yeah, so, I mean...
You can't, hence Abraham's silence.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of, we should think about that, right? Mm-hmm. This Abraham is supposed to be a model for eventually the adoption of Christianity, right? Mm-hmm. So, like, I think we ought to be really skeptical about people who are constantly going off about their Christianity all the time.
Yeah,
I think we have to be really skeptical about people like, let me talk to you about my friend Jesus, or let me tell you about how Jesus got me a new car, or balance my checkbook, or whatever. Like, the way that Kierkegaard understands it is, like, if you're really in the right relationship, like, it's going to be this subjective understanding that's, like, very special between you and God. Mm-hmm. And in a way, constantly talking about it in earthly terms, like,
it dilutes,
it defrauds it in some way.
If it doesn't do it justice, then it probably sort of cheapens it.
So you have, and that's why Kierkegaard's very interested in this indirect communication and using the pseudonyms and telling stories.
Mm-hmm. Would prayer be a form of indirect communication?
Not between the person and God, but so that would be a form of direct. Yeah. That would be directly sort of
right. But I was thinking about prayer in a congregation or a group.
I don't know how Kierkegaard would have felt about that. He does think that you can't have faith in mass. Mm-hmm. He doesn't think that, like you were saying earlier with Abraham, like Abraham can't lead or send anyone away from faith. Like, like Jordan, if you're going to come to faith, you have to do it. I can't do it for you. I can't be like, oh Jesus, like please make Jordan a Christian. Like I can't do that shit. Like you would have to totally do that.
Yeah.
And so I can kind of tell you about Soren Kierkegaard, and I can drop Jesus bombs and stuff like that here and there. But like, if I try to do it for you, like I commit so many sins if I try to do that. On the one hand, I entertain an immoral narcissism that I have God's power. Mm-hmm. Only Christ can convert you. I can't. Mm-hmm. And the other perspective is that I actually assail your freedom. If I could like brainwash you into becoming a Christian or whatever, you wouldn't really be a Christian. You'd just be you'd be an automaton. You'd have Stockholm syndrome. Mm-hmm. I'd be a cult leader. And that's not what God wants me to do.
Yeah, and that's so interesting because the concept of not being able to convert, only Christ can, that kind of turns a lot of traditional Christianity completely on its head.
Yeah, a lot of people do. There are some evangelicals that don't like this because what it also means is that you can't, because your own religious pilgrimage is constantly up for renewal, you only really have time to worry about yourself. Like I have to work on myself every single day. But what do we see in, like, we talk about, like, I see people talk about, oh my God, so many people got baptized at church on Sunday, so many souls got saved, or we did this mission trip and this happened, or you want to judge people. You want to say, well, those people are going to hell or whatever. The fact of the matter is this understanding of Christianity doesn't allow for the individual to condemn anyone or take credit for the salvation of others. And that's a big problem within a lot of evangelical Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, especially...
It's not going to sit well with all of them.
And that's not going to really sit well with the Danish church either.
Nice segue. Nice tie-in.
You know.
It was good. By the way, you guys should totally check out Jordan's historical overview of Soren Kierkegaard.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, that's what the Danish church wanted to do. The fact that the church could withhold sacraments and saying, hey, we're not really happy with you about this little affair that you had, or, well, you shouldn't have, it was a bad idea to steal that cow. You shouldn't have done that. So good luck getting communion on Sunday.
And what does Kierkegaard think about that? Because Kierkegaard would see that as an exercise of some sort of worldly power over people.
So
power that the church does not have.
Right. So if Kierkegaard pretty much says, hey, like the clergy, they don't have a role in your salvation, that's going to rest a ton of power.
It's radical. It restores the power to the people. It restores the power to God and to people.
Right.
People are totally in control of their religious lives. Mm-hmm. So just like Luther restored the power to the people from the papacy, I believe Kierkegaard believed he was doing the same thing with the Lutheran church with modern day Protestantism in Copenhagen.
Yeah, absolutely.
And look, it couldn't be more timely for America. Mm-hmm. So, a lot of people say to me, like, why are you studying all this existentialism crap? It's like for a bunch of bourgeois people who have time to smoke clove cigarettes in cafes in Paris. Really? You're telling me you can't find an application to this stuff, to the things that happen in the news, like every day, especially today?
Yeah.
So, I don't know. It's at 40 minutes. Probably should wrap it up there, unless you want to say anything else.
No, I think we got everything covered.
I think we did a pretty good overview. Yeah. I'm proud of us. I think we did good, especially since it was a lot of work. All right. See you guys. We'll have more stuff for you soon.
Bye, everyone. Yeah, thanks for tuning in.
Download the Noetic app. Get all our courses and podcasts and lectures and blah, blah, blah forever there. It's the copyright of Noetic Recordings 2016. And sayonara. Bye.
See ya.